Welcome to the Writers Co-op, a business podcast for freelance writers everywhere. We're your co-hosts. I'm Wudan Yan.
And I'm Jenny Gritters.
This week on the podcast, we are going to dig into the nitty-gritty of contracts.
By now, we've talked about how to make the move into becoming a freelancer and where to find assignments, as well as money.
And if you haven't listened to those episodes yet, please do, because they really serve as a precedent to what we're going to discuss today, which is finalizing an assignment with a contract. What do?
Hopefully you sign a contract. Hopefully you get a contract, but that can be really complicated.
Yeah, contracts are super important because they represent an agreement between you and the publication, and it makes both of you accountable. But like Jenny said, they can be really confusing. What makes for a good contract or a bad one? What do you do if a contract is bad? And what if a publication doesn't even have a contract?
Honestly, this feels like one of the trickiest parts of freelancing for me. I still get pretty overwhelmed by contracts, and I'm really excited for this episode because I think you'll all find the interview that Wudan did really helpful. It was definitely helpful to me and helped me feel like I had some tools to navigate this often tricky process.
I wonder if it would make sense for us to start this episode to share, why contracts are important by telling a story about how we've been screwed over by some of them, by contracts or lack thereof.
Yeah, I have a good one, or a bad one, however you want to look at it. So I was working with a publication that I'd worked with before, but before the assignments had been all news pieces, and this piece was a long-form investigative piece. I'd signed a contract with them for those news pieces, but I never looked at the contract very closely. Never do this. That's rule number one.
Hindsight is 20/20.
Yeah. So then I got to this big assignment, which ended up including some pretty heavy investigational work on a major essential oil company. It turned out that they were doing some shady stuff, but what I also discovered was that they were really lawsuit prone. So I realized about halfway through my reporting, I remember I was laying in bed and I sat up in the middle of the night and realized oh God, I should probably look at my contract, because what happens if this company tries to sue me? Will I be liable? So I read the contract the next morning, and it turned out I was 100% liable for any kind of lawsuit, even though the company 100% owned the story I was writing. So that's a terrible contract. And when I brought this issue to the editor, he was new and he felt really terrible, and he was pretty receptive to changing it, but the legal team was not willing to change the contract at all. So ultimately, I ended up having to stop working on the story. I lost 20 or 30 hours of paid reporting work, and I will probably place that story somewhere else later at a place where the indemnity clause, which is what would have held me liable, would hold me liable only if I made factual errors in my reporting, which wasn't the case in this contract. But I haven't done that yet. So it was a bad situation. The story was a good one that I felt was really important, and it was a bummer to lose all that paid work. So I learned my lesson. I won't do that again.
That story kind of makes me so infuriated. On one hand, I want to say it's exploitative to realize that the publisher will own the story but won't take on any liability. But that, on the other hand, I realized it's not an editor who drafted this, it's that publisher's legal team.
Totally. I don't think the editor I was working with even knew that the contract looked like that, right? He was totally surprised when I told him that that's the way that the indemnity clause was mapping out, and that I would be completely liable. I would have to pay for legal fees, and it would have been a big issue. Wudan, what about you?
The first story I had ever traveled for, and for it, I also hired a translator. I got a contract from my editor as I was heading out the door to catch my flight, and I basically signed it willy-nilly without reading the fine print. I think you kind of see now that the theme is read your contract.
Yes, read the fine print.
Yes. So my contract didn't have a kill fee in it. I traveled, I went to Myanmar, I reported the story, I filed the story. The editor sat on it for quite a few weeks, and after giving it a pass back, he decided to kill it. But I had no kill fee protecting me, so I ended up probably accepting way less than I should have when we were trying to negotiate it after the fact. Now I know that if a contract doesn't have a kill fee in it and you file a story and the story is killed for whatever reason, the publisher is technically on the hook for paying you all that money.
That's no good, especially because stories for travel requires so much more of an investment, I feel like. That's such a bummer. But I feel like especially with contracts, you really don't know what you don't know until something like this happens, right? You kind of learn the hard way.
Yes, definitely. That's why today we're going to discuss how to protect ourselves by negotiating our contracts. To do that, we've brought on a guest. Her name is KJ Yossman, and she's excellent. Here's the interview. So KJ Yossman is a long-form writer with bylines at the New York Times, Marie Claire, RollingStone.com, and the Times of London. Before journalism, she qualified as a lawyer with experience in contracts and media law. And I would just add, this is, in my experience, at least kind of a rare background to come into journalism with. Today, KJ and I will be talking about things that we want to consider when signing a contract. Why do we even need a contract? Like sometimes I've run into a situation where publications won't even have a contract on file and they kind of just want you to start working. Is that a situation we want to avoid?
So I think sometimes for freelancers, not having a contract can actually be better because of the power imbalance between freelancers and publications. Sometimes where they do make you sign a contract, you end up signing over all your rights, which is actually the situation you want to avoid. The main thing I think for freelancers to know, and I see this crop up a lot on forums, you can have a contract by email, you can have a contract via Twitter DM, you can have a contract via telephone. You don't need a piece of paper saying contract. What you need is to have a contract is three things, and that's offer, acceptance, and consideration. So that means when you email a pitch and they accept that pitch, and then there's even an expectation, but certainly a discussion of fee, you have a contract. And actually, as a freelancer, sometimes it can be safer to have just an email contract. Obviously, an oral contract by telephone, it's rare. That's a bit more difficult because you'd have trouble proving it. But certainly by email or even Twitter DM, you have what you need to be able to get paid. And so that's the main thing. Beyond that, depending on what kind of content you're writing and who for, that's when you start to get into other rights and other responsibilities. And that's where you need to be quite careful.
That's super interesting when you said sometimes if there's no formal email, is the interpretation like, okay, if there's nothing else to agree on, all we have is the commission for the story and a fee and a deadline, right? It's like you can't even sign away your rights because you didn't even agree to any.
Exactly. And actually, in some ways it's safer. I mean, that's why obviously most, especially big name publications, will make you sign a contract of some sort. And we can talk about how to negotiate that shortly. But yeah, I mean, I personally think, lawyers obviously wouldn't agree necessarily, but the commercial reality, and that's why I think my experience as both a journalist and a lawyer of understanding what you're signing, but also the commercial reality that I've personally experienced as well of trying to negotiate with big publications. You can't always do it the most tidy way legally. And so, yeah, if all you have is, I promise to write you this article and you're going to pay me $100 or hopefully more, that's your contract. That's your contract. And if you deliver that article on time and the word count, and to be honest, it doesn't even necessarily have to be of reasonable quality because that's not a contractual term. The only contractual terms are the promise to deliver the work and their promise or their implied promise that they're going to pay you for it. Mm-hmm. And that at least means you can get paid.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So KJ, in a situation where the contract isn't great, like the payment terms, like you get paid on publication and not acceptance, or there's no kill fee, how can somebody start negotiating contracts? I can see a situation where, it's scary to get back to your editor with questions, especially when you really need the work. So how do you negotiate for better contract terms without the publisher scrapping the deal?
I wish I could answer it. I mean, it's the kind of dilemma facing every freelancer. And even with my legal background, I have had publishers scrap deals or certainly threaten to deny me future work, even when they really liked what I've delivered, because I won't sign their contract. There was a big publisher I had that situation with, and I'm still in touch with the editor and we still talk about me possibly doing more work for them, but nothing I've pitched since has made it. So I can't help but wonder whether they're holding true. And also, even if I do write for them again, I probably will have to end up signing that contract, because now I know what it is they want me to sign. Previously, it was given to me after I'd already delivered the article. So yeah, I mean, it's a really, really tough situation. And even I was recently speaking to a lawyer who said that even if he went into bat for me himself, if they won't budge, there's not even much more he can do. So sometimes even hiring a lawyer isn't necessarily going to help you. It's a really, really tough call, and it goes to show just how vulnerable we are as freelancers. Having said that, of course, you can start to negotiate, and ultimately it comes down to things like, is this a topic you want to write about again? Is this a topic that you could see yourself writing a book about or being turned into a TV or a film? Is it a topic that is quite risky for you to write about? So that's when we get into indemnity clauses, which I'm sure we'll discuss shortly. So it kind of depends, if it's a little 200-word piece about a new fashion line that's come out for a fashion website, and they want you to sign something quite punitive, I think it's probably better to keep the relationship in that situation, depending on exactly what it is they want you to sign. Whereas, with the riskier pieces or the ones that have more potential in different formats, that's where you start to have to become very, very careful about what you're signing, because, and this is the point that I face myself, is that you can't sign a contract and think they'll never hold me to it, because the point is, if you're signing it, then they may. They won't always necessarily, because again, that's the commercial reality of, is a big publication going to sue a freelancer and risk that bad publicity and all that kind of thing? Probably not. But you're signing a contract, it's a real document, and you can well be held to it.
Yeah. Right. It's a real document, and it's a legal document too.
Exactly.
Do you have kind of a formula that you follow when you get a contract from an editor that you're working with the first time or a second time, depending on that publication's process? And how do you negotiate contracts? Like, what is it that you actually write in your email?
Well, firstly, I just want to say that, again, even with someone with a legal background, my heart beats very, very fast when I send those emails. And sometimes I then avoid checking my email for the rest of the day because it is terrifying. And that's normal. But I think the more you do it, the more you will become used to doing it. And I think the more you'll see the value in it. Sometimes I'll mark it up. So if they send it to me, I can write a few notes or go through the clauses and I just had a few notes that I wanted to raise, if it's possible to, please change these. I start off very softly. So I'm sort of quite polite and a little bit meek, and, start off that way. And then obviously you can ramp it up a little bit. Another trick is that you can blame it on a mythical legal advisor. So you can say, I just had a friend or someone look at this, and, I had a legal advisor look at this, and they've just suggested if it's possible to change the following clauses. So that can sometimes feel like you're taking the weight off yourself, like you're not the one causing the problems.
Yeah, I think everyone has a different strategy. Mine is very direct, and I just copy and paste what the contract says, and then I add changes in italics or bold for stuff that I want added or deleted, because I think sometimes publishers appreciate that, because the editor doesn't have to rewrite that legalese, because again, my editor didn't write the contract, it's the publisher's legal department.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is what I do as well, of course. So, I say, if it would be possible to make the following changes, and then, I'll go through clause 1.3. Can we please add, this word in here? Clause 5.6. Can we please remove it entirely? It doesn't hurt to go in with every single change that you want, because they may negotiate you down, and you may have to make a decision about which ones are more crucial if they're not going to give you all of them. The other thing is, it's usually, quite often it's not the editors who are going to even be looking at it. They'll pass it on to their business department or their contracts department or whoever it is. So certainly making life as easy as possible for them is, and the thing is, most editors are quite understanding, actually, and they will just pass it on to whoever's the relevant person. They won't negotiate it themselves, and I don't think they'll think badly of you for negotiating it at all. But it just depends on how difficult their business department are going to be about it, because sometimes they can be.
For sure. Yeah, I've seen that myself too. When you get a contract, what are the main parts and components that you really scrutinize when you receive it?
The indemnification clause can be very punitive and really is absurd. So an indemnification clause is you are basically promising to make good any losses that the company may incur as a result of what may or may not be your failing. So I have seen an indemnification clause where it was so broad that, they're supposed to be fact checking it and they have lawyers in house who look at everything that's being published. So if I've delivered it to the best of my ability and they're okaying it legally, then it's absurd that the onus should be on me to indemnify them if somebody decides to sue them. And they can include things like you have to pay for their legal costs. So you can imagine paying for a big New York publisher's legal costs. That's going to be pretty damaging to most people's finances. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely a big one. And the first port of call is to try and get it removed, but often they won't. And then the only thing you can do is try and soften it as much as possible. Often it'll be linked to warranties. So that's the other thing. So your warranties are your promises. So usually it'll be like, you're promising that it's not plagiarized, that you're promising it's original work, that you're promising you have delivered truthful work. So things like that you haven't infringed anyone's copyright. And then the indemnification clause may be linked to that, so that if you have breached one of those warranties, you could be potentially held liable for any lawsuit that results. But they can chuck anything in those warranties. So you should be looking at the warranties as well. So one thing that I got put into one contract, I added the language to the best of my knowledge, because I was a lawyer, but I'm not a lawyer anymore. And they have lawyers who are meant to be, looking at all this stuff and deciding whether it's fit for publication. And I shouldn't be held responsible if they have legaled something, said that it's okay to publish, and then it turns out it wasn't. But obviously, to the best of my knowledge, I have delivered something that is truthful, that isn't plagiarized, and that doesn't infringe on somebody else's copyright. So warranties, indemnification clause, kill fee, I know you mentioned that, try and get it bumped up. Again, this is where not having a contract can be more beneficial. If you don't have a contract, they kill the article, and you're waiting for your money, you can invoice them for the whole amount. You don't have to invoice for 20% or 50%. The contract is you deliver the work and they pay you. What they choose to do with that work is up to them. If they don't want to publish it, that's on them. But obviously, once it's written to contract, they will usually try and lowball you. So I do try and get that raised. And again, it depends on the kind of article you're looking at. Is it 500 word, pretty easy to put together in an hour? Is it worth burning a bridge to get the kill fee raised by 25%? But if it's a long form, print piece that involved thousands of words and, a lot of interviews, the idea of walking away with 25% of what you're going to get is quite painful. So yeah, that's another thing to look out for. And then of course, you're right. And that's film, TV, and potentially if you want to write a book as well about it. Very, very hard to negotiate those now because of the way the media landscape is. So you can try, but it's very hard to either get the rights to revert back to you, or, I think the best you can hope for is some kind of fee splitting. But again, most people, when they write an article, they're not really thinking that this could be a film or TV show. And so you really have to look at the article and think, could it,
With regards to the rights, let's talk about that some more. How might somebody know if they're signing away all their rights? Like, what would that legalese possibly look like?
Things like they remain the sole and exclusive property of the publishing company. And also it will usually say it's a work made for hire. And that's where you have to be careful. There's two types of contract, and it won't always say clearly which one it is, whether it's a work for hire where you're effectively handing over your intellectual property, or a license. And a license will usually, they get the benefit of your intellectual property for a short amount of time and then it reverts back to you. And yeah, so it will say things like they have the sole and exclusive right to use it and to develop it in any and all media and formats and technologies throughout the universe, etc., etc. So it's very, very strong language, but if you read it carefully, you will see that you're handing it over to them in perpetuity, because it may also say that.
Right. So those are things to look out for. And then I know some contracts will say that the publisher will have exclusive rights for 30, 60, or 90 days. Like, what is standard, and at what point is it possibly worth pushing back on?
I think an exclusive right for 90 days actually, honestly, in the current media landscape, to me seems fairly good. I actually rarely see that. I often see that it's much more stringent than that. So I think, if it is reverting back to you at some point, then already you're onto a winner. But it depends what you want to do with it. So, if you see something within 90 days that you want to do with it, then you might want to push back. But I think as long as it's reverting back to you at some point within, I'd say 6 months, then I think that's pretty good going.
Interesting. I didn't know that time frame. That's good to hear from you.
I say that not as someone with necessarily expertise in the time frame. It's more just from a commercial point of view, because after 6 months, if it does revert back to you and you can do whatever you want with it, then that's fine, really. I mean, it just depends. I can't necessarily think, because once it's been published, you're not going to publish it again within 6 months or anything like that. So it's really just thinking, what is it that you plan to do with it, or you would want to do with it, or that they could possibly do with it. So actually, just to add another clause to look out for is syndication rights, and that's when they can sell the article. And this tends to be more newspapers do this, but they'll sell the article to different countries, different publications, and to make sure that you get a fee or some sort of percentage if they do sell it on again.
I need to ask for that.
Yeah.
KJ, another question we had was, this is something that I run into, and I think many freelancers have, is scope creep. When an assignment balloons beyond what was originally discussed, like a writer has more rounds of edits suddenly, the editor asks the writer for more information, and that balloons the word count above what was agreed upon in a scope of work or contract. What are some things in a contract that freelancers can negotiate for to protect themselves against scope creep?
It's a really difficult one, because this is where you are coming into direct contact with sort of an editor's authority. And if what you've delivered, they had a different idea and they want to add all this detail in. And I've absolutely had articles that have ballooned from, 3,500 to 7,000 words. It's a really difficult one. I mean, because the way that you would protect yourself in a contract would be very onerous. I mean, I've never done it, and I couldn't really see it being done in a way that isn't going to make it feel like you're stepping on an editor's toes, because you'd be looking at saying, well, the most simple way, I think, is certainly to say, if it's over 20% more word count than was initially proposed, then you're going to get however much more money, and you could scale it, and you could have that kind of scale. That would be the most simple. But it is a difficult one where, let's say, you hand it in and they had just a slightly different idea for it. They want you to go back and do more work. You do the more work, it balloons, and then they cut it back down. So ultimately what they publish is still not that much more than the original word count. It is difficult to plan for that and to protect yourself. And I think it's one of the things that actually, rather than having in a contract, which becomes sort of binding, and that's the problem with putting it in a contract as well, I think it almost gives this sense that you're not going to deliver what they want. It almost slightly undermines your professionalism in a way. They might look at it and think, well, why are we going to go back and forth on this 500 times? Of course, that might not be the writer's fault, at all, but putting it in the contract, I think, slightly gives the wrong message. And I think it's one of the things to be more dynamic about, where you see it start to happen. You can step in and say, well, this is ballooned to double what we originally discussed. Can I check whether you have budget to increase my fee to reflect this? Or, I see that the story is creeping up in word count, will this be reflected in my fee? Can we discuss that? And I think, again, it takes some courage sometimes to be able to interrupt that often very fast, frantic process of editing and talk about it. But if you can, you should. Again, I'm not always as, I sort of need to practice what I preach a bit more, because sometimes it's just quite hard to interrupt that process to talk about money, really. But I think it's probably something better done by email as you see it start to happen.
That's super interesting to hear you say that, because, well, 2 points actually. Like, sometimes it's very easy to protect yourself against scope creep if you're getting paid by the word for an assignment, right? And for me, it's a simple, well, I like the creator, the writer, the contractor will be paid $1 a word per published or per assigned word, whichever is higher. Like, that's the language I choose to use. The other thing I think is interesting is that some publishers will call contracts scope of work. So if my story creeps beyond what was originally proposed in that original scope of work, I think that gives a writer some more leverage, right? To be like, hey, I revisited the contract and I know the story's going in a different direction. Can we revise it, or can you send me a different scope of work? I think that's just interesting terminology for what's happening, right?
Yeah, and I think the line that you used about whichever is higher, I think that's excellent language. So anyone listening to this should definitely write that down. But again, it's just that difficulty of sometimes these things move so fast. It's just raising it in any sense, I think, is a good thing, because again, if you have an argument about it later, at least you can show that you raised it. I think the problem is that I've encountered is sometimes when I do say, oh, it's starting to creep beyond what we initially discussed, I've had editors say, no, it isn't. And then what do? That's when you're starting. And that's what I mean about stepping on your editor's toes, because at that point do you necessarily want to jeopardize the relationship and say, well, it is. It's very difficult. But I think where you feel you're being taken for a ride, listen to your gut instinct. Because even if it says scope of work and you feel it's going beyond that, it's being able to prove that. Because especially when you pitch a story, or even sometimes when you're assigned a story, the story doesn't always go the way you think it's going to go once you start reporting it. And I think that's what one of the difficulties is. So I think be nimble about it and be brave and raise it by email and see what your editor comes back with. But sometimes it's one of those that you have to swallow, unfortunately, if you think that ultimately it's going to be a relatively fair rate and the benefit of being published in this publication is going to be good for your future career. That can, influence your decision.
Yeah, it's a very delicate balance. One thing that writers listening would probably want to hear about is payment, especially late payment. So what can you put in your contract to prevent against late payment? And is there any recourse if a publication doesn't pay on time, but their contract says that they have to?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're probably the expert in this with your excellent piece about late payments. I think that's the best starting point. But I think you can obviously put the language in yourself. And obviously, as you say, some contracts have it in already. And I think it's, again, just a matter of being brave and just being very matter of fact about it and almost kind of acting as your own attorney or your own business manager. And sometimes, you just tack it on and see what they come back with. But it's another difficult balance because, I thought your piece demonstrated that very clearly, where some of the responses you got were very almost outraged that you were asking for this when you were absolutely entitled to, both in state law and contractually. So when you're faced with an attitude like that from people who, have the safety of continuous employment, unlike freelancers, it can be very difficult to negotiate and to really go out and bat for yourself. So I think there are laws, depending on where you are. There's actually laws in the UK as well, late payment of contracts. I know New York has one. If you Google the state you're in, or even the state that the publication is in, again, these things tend to be a little bit unclear, but usually you can look at, most contracts will say at the bottom which jurisdiction they believe to be under. So that's a good starting point. You can Google and actually just see which states or which jurisdictions have laws that protect you. And you can refer to those in your invoice, even if they're not in the contract, because they're implied into the contract. They supersede the contract effectively.
That's really good advice too. Okay, last question for you, KJ. What are other things in contracts you should never sign? Like, what are the red flags that you warn other freelancers about that we haven't yet discussed?
I think I am very careful about my warranties, actually, which we have discussed, but I think I'm very, very careful about what I'm promising contractually, and also breaches as well. So when they start talking about breaches where they cannot pay you for breaching something, usually breaching your warranties, what I usually try and insert is the word material breach. So rather than any breach, because you could have a really minor breach, like, you delivered a day late, that's a breach. But it's not a material breach because they haven't had to print a blank page or something. So material breach means something that's really, really egregious, like you literally plagiarized an entire article. So that's one thing that I always look out for. What are they making me warrant for, and what are they holding me to in terms of the breach? And then sometimes I think just anything that seems off to you. The thing I think as well that I've seen, and I've been shocked really since becoming a freelance journalist, is how many contracts are either not written by lawyers, even at big publishing companies, or they are repurposed contracts. I was given one contract that was clearly meant to be for photographers, and it made absolutely no sense. It had been written for photographers and sort of mangled, and just really made no sense for me to sign. And so it was one of the things that they wanted me to, I had a big sort of fight with them about this, was they wanted me to assign my likeness, my social media handle, and my name in perpetuity throughout the universe. So whenever you see those words, start to look at exactly what they want. And it wasn't even in connection with the article. It was just for anything, really. And I said, this is absurd. You can't expect me to sign that. So weird things like that. And also things that always think about timing and jurisdiction. So for example, one clause that you should be careful of as well is a non-compete. And it won't say non-compete, but it will say something like, you can't write about this topic ever again, or you can't write about this topic for a year or whatever. And again, one of the publishing companies that unfortunately they weren't very happy, but that was an article that I'd written about the anniversary of a building, and the language said something like, you can't write about a similar topic again. And I said, well, what's similar? A building? The same building? It wasn't defined in any way. So what you want to look for as well is definitions. And because it wasn't defined in any way, that made it potentially very, very broad. And there was no time limit to this clause. So it didn't say you can't write about a similar topic for 6 months or a year, which you can understand for a magazine. They want to be the only ones to write about this for a certain period of time. But if there's no time limit, you're effectively agreeing that you will never write about that topic again, which is absurd, because especially if you have a beat, Mm-hmm. So be careful, look for time limits. If there isn't one, ask for one. Look for words that are vague. Are they defined anywhere? Okay, so I can't write about something similar. What does similar mean? Can we define it? And that's quite a gentle negotiation. Can we at least define what this means? And I think just read it through carefully and try and break it down as much as possible and translate it almost for yourself. So what is it asking me to do? And thinking about this logically doesn't make sense. So me never writing about a building again doesn't make any sense. And I can't agree to that.
Yeah, I feel like our conversation is a testament to the fact that we should be reading our contracts and spending time wading through the legalese, and if not negotiating, at least asking questions, right? Because what are we really signing away?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the main thing to impart, is that these are real documents, and you don't know that there are just unforeseen consequences, sometimes negative, well, for a freelancer, usually negative, of signing them, whether it's signing away your rights, that it turns out this was a brilliant idea and they want to make a film about it, or that you have indemnified them and someone sues you for, let's say, libel or something, and you've agreed to indemnify the company and pay their legal costs. I mean, that's crazy. So I think you have to be really careful what you're signing. And I think if we can try and all negotiate as much as possible, maybe they will start including some fairer terms, because I think some of the stuff that I see that I negotiate or that I refuse to sign, I can only imagine there are other people signing those contracts because they just trust the company, or they think it maybe doesn't matter, or they just don't want to deal with it, which I totally get. But, if more of us maybe start fighting back a little bit, then, the already very unfair power imbalance will at least shift to a bit more of a middle ground.
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to end. Thank you so much, KJ, for talking with us on the Writers Co-op.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, that was so good, and there was so much good information in there. But we know that the legalese can feel really complicated, so we're going to send you a tips sheet if you're an All Access Co-op member on Patreon. And it's going to contain everything that Wudan talked about with KJ, plus a little card to stick to your desktop or bulletin board with a checklist of the most important bits and pieces of dealing with contracts. And with that, you will also get some language that you can use if you decide to negotiate your contracts. So Wudan sent me some of this language a while back, and it's been a total game changer for me in terms of keeping me confident when I'm trying to get a better deal with a publisher. So, for example, after that hellish story with the indemnity clause, I now have new language that I suggest to publications to replace their indemnity clause if it doesn't work for me. And usually that process works. So if you're an All Access member, you'll be receiving all of that this week.
One thing I do want to add to my conversation with KJ and this episode generally is I think I get a lot of questions around the lines of, okay, if we're just writing a fun short story and the contract gets to us and we see a bad indemnity clause or a rights grab, do we negotiate it?
So I feel like the answer is yes, because that was my problem. One bad contract in the beginning came back to bite me when things got more complicated.
I also truly believe in that, like negotiating for better terms no matter what, because that not only helps us, but our colleagues. And I have a few publications I've contributed to that have actually changed their legal language in their contracts because of wording I've proposed.
That's amazing. Honestly, in my experience, and I've been an editor as well, editors are often just as in the dark about contract language as freelancers. They're sort of just handing you something that the legal team has handed to them. So there are a lot of good, empathetic editors out there who are going to want to work with you to set up a situation that protects you and your work. But I also think you're right that we owe it to each other to hold publications to higher standards, especially when it comes to contracts. Like, this is where it starts.
It's also worth saying that sometimes negotiations, even if they're level-headed, seemingly straightforward, that they won't work.
Yeah.
And then you have to decide if it's worth your time and risk to continue working with that publisher. What if they don't pay you, or what if they don't pay you on time? What if they kill your assignment? Is it worth the potential for a byline? Like, what byline is worth all of that for you?
Yeah, in my experience, also the publications that have bad contracts or who aren't willing to adjust them are typically not fantastic to work with in other ways as well in the long run. So the contract is kind of one of those early red flags that the relationship might not be one that you want to invest in.
Exactly. But then again, that's up to you, and it's a privilege to say no to work.
Totally. I do think this also comes back to that abundance mindset we talked about before, that if you say no to that assignment, more work will come. There's enough work out there. And also the belief that you should be treated well, because honestly, we both believe that you should be treated well, and we hope you believe that too.
There's so much more to contracts that we probably were not able to cover in this one episode. If you're listening and have a question you want to see addressed, sign up to support us on Patreon, and you'll be able to send us notes, questions about anything else you've wondered about. We are planning a fun question and answer episode in 2 weeks, so please send us all of your questions, and we will do our best to get all of those answered. But that's it for today, and we will see you next time. Bye, Jenny.
Bye, Wudan. Season 1 of the Writers Co-op is made possible by a grant from the National Association of Science Writers. The Writers Co-op is hosted by me, Jenny Gritters, and Wudan Yan, and produced by Susan Vallet.